Welcome to the Attract Your Ideal Clients podcast. This show is for entrepreneurs who sell their expertise, including trainers, consultants, and coaches looking for real world, actionable marketing advice to help them identify their competitive strengths, find and fix the marketing bottlenecks that are holding them back, and confidently make the right marketing decisions for their unique business. In today's episode, we'll be exploring how to generate referrals in a way that are much more focused and proactive. It's easy to think that doing great work is all that's needed to get referrals. But if you're waiting passively for people to refer you business, you're probably missing out on a lot of opportunities to serve more of your ideal clients. Joining me today is Rob Tracz of Tracz Coaching. And if you enjoy the show, I hope you'll consider subscribing and leaving a review. Here we go. All right. So starting out, I wanted to ask if you could just very briefly describe what you do, the problems you solve, who you work with.
Yeah, sure. So I consider myself a personal growth strategist, and I help driven individuals overcome things like stagnation and burnout. Those are the individuals who benefit most with working with me are those who are on the verge of more or know that they have more in the tank and they're out there trying almost everything under the sun, but they're not seeming to catch that traction to kind of move them to the next level. Together, we usually sit down and review. It's typically one or more of the six principles that I kind of live my life by and also my coaching by. We kind of dive into what areas do we need to work on and what new areas do we need to might maybe develop to kind of help us get to that next level. And ultimately, we just work together to help each other look good, feel good, and do great things.
I like that. Look good, feel good, and do great things. I think that pretty much sums it up, right? Best
Yeah.
a best life. When you and I first chatted a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about you have a pretty unique approach to referral building, right? So, one of the things I'm having these conversations with people like yourself out there doing this, building these types of businesses is, the challenge of attracting these clients to begin with. It's just I don't want to say the hardest part, but for a lot of coaches and trainers and consultants, that's very difficult, right? Or at least difficult to do consistently. And you shared this approach that you have for attracting or building your referral pipeline. All right. So
Mhm.
we just chatted before we hit record and you explained it and I think I have a good handle on it, but rather than butcher it myself, I'm going to hand you the mic. And if you could just kind of walk the listeners through what this process looks like, maybe how you got the idea, just anything that you think would be helpful for people trying to think of how do I actually generate more referrals on a more proactive way?
Yeah, of course. A lot of my different principles and coaching practices, I direct a lot of things back to awareness and self-awareness. So in order for myself to, when I first dove into my new coaching and the performance coaching world, transitioning from strength and conditioning, I needed to kind of dive in and figure out, okay, so who is my ideal client? And a mentor of mine once told me that you are most powerfully positioned to serve who you previously were. So for me, I had to think to that. And I'm like, okay, well, who was I and where was I? And how do I figure this out? And I'm a big acronym guy. So I love to try to work acronyms into everything I do. And it helps me remember it. It makes it easier for me to teach it. And for this specifically, it's all about gaining clarity and understanding yourself. And I'm a big fan of Pirates of the Caribbean. So I like to tell everybody to fly your own flag. Like you got the different pirate ships, they've got their own unique flags. So figure out what your flag is. And in order to do that, we work through the letters. So the first letter being F is your foundational values. So what are the values that you hold like most important to you? And this is kind of like a further step into like, okay, how do you live your life? What are the things that you stand by the strongest? And for me personally, I'll kind of dive in real quick. For me, again, acronyms, I like to go at my own pace. So P is that I'm progressing towards mastery. So no matter what I'm doing, I'm always looking to get a little bit better. I'm a very curious individual, so I'm constantly learning and taking little tidbits from people that I'm communicating with. The second letter, A, is adventure. So I'm always seeking fun in everything that I do. I try to spin it so that it's enjoyable to me and to everybody around myself. And then the third letter, C, is contribute. So contribute often. So holding others higher than myself and making sure that I give back whenever possible. And then the last letter is E, which is embodying freedom. So remembering to myself that no matter what I'm doing or situation that I'm currently in, I have a choice. And it's if I can't react, it's how do I react to the choices and things that happen to me. So having that really isn't as easy as I thought it was in the beginning. A lot of people are always talking about diving into your values. So this takes a little bit longer to dive in and figure things out. So remember, we're going back to the FLAG acronym now. So F is those foundational values, figuring those out, what stands true to you. And that'll be able to help you kind of direct your compass. So for myself, a lot of my clients that I work with, they have to have at least one or two of those values that I can see in themselves. So if they're not driven or they're not progressing or they're not excited about learning, probably not going to be a big fit for me. If they're not very fun or they like to they don't like to enjoy themselves or seek fun in what they're doing, they might not be the best, and so on and so on. But let's move to the next letter, the L in flag. So this one's a little more fun. Since the first one's all that nitty gritty and kind of tough and boring sometimes trying to figure it out, the L is lifestyle traits. So what kind of things in your life make you unique? So for me, it's like, what kind of car do you like to drive? Or what would be your dream car? What's your favorite color? What kind of food do you like to eat on Friday nights? And thinking about these can be fun, and then you're listing them all out, and then you take it to the next step level and say, okay, well, why? So for example, my favorite color is red. All right, well, why? I think it's cool. It could be like a tough color if it wants to be show aggression, but it could also be a passionate color showing love, and that reflects myself. I could be a tough guy, but I'm also very caring, and I can be very emotional and thinking through feelings and getting into things. Then also my favorite car, what I've been driving for a while, is a Jeep Wrangler. I think it's nice, rugged, tough, but it's also very customizable and unique. You can drive with the roof down, you can blast the music, or you can bundle it up and go off-roading. So diving in, having fun with the lifestyle traits, the kinds of foods and things like that gives you that unique feeling for yourself. So then you can start to attract other individuals who might have similar interests with you. Now, moving to the A letter in the acronym is aspirational goals. So, what is it that you want to achieve? What are the things you're trying to work towards? In longer term picture, so like maybe 10, 15 years, but then also bringing it all the way down into like what are the things that we want to be working on this week, and really mapping those things out and creating actions and systems and plans to help us get towards those goals. And the final letter is G, which is for growth opportunities, where we do a little mini SWOT analysis to kind of see what our strengths and our opportunities for advancement, so that we can play to our strengths and then hopefully hire out or find somebody else or work with other and collaborate with other individuals who might be a little more skilled or stronger in different areas. Once you kind of have that approach down, you've got that flag all figured out. Now we can get a little bit better of who we're attracting. Kind of like how I said before, if their values don't align with mine, we might not be the best fit. It might be a little bit easier for me to connect with people if I go to other Jeep events, or if I'm hanging out at the sushi place, or if I'm going to the health and wellness expo. It's just easier for me to get around bigger people to create better connections, in which we can kind of dive into the next part of my whole process on getting into the referrals and such.
Yeah, definitely want to get into that process, but I wanted to pause a second here. There's so much that I want to unpack in what you just shared because I think honestly, this is I've talked to a lot of people about this topic, as you can imagine. I've never talked to anybody who's done such a good description of sharing why their ideal clients are their ideal clients. And what I love so much about what you shared, first of all, the acronym, yes, it's wonderful to have that because it gives you structure, right? Personal improvement, growth concepts can get really difficult to track after a while, right? So it is
Oh
so
yeah.
helpful. But what's so great about it is that you have decided and I'm paraphrasing based on my understanding or my perspectives. I'm not saying that this is how you necessarily describe it, but you've decided that you are not for everybody. And you're not trying to serve everybody, although I'm sure you would love to, right? It's not a matter of not caring. It's a matter of there's only one person, and you know that you're a good fit for X number of people, and maybe not the best for others. And that first step, in my opinion, is the step that is most often skipped by companies of all types, not just people in the expertise space, but it's also the hardest to get around when you skip it. So, for instance, when somebody just goes into the marketplace and let's say they have a background in training and leadership training, I'll just use that example a lot, and they decide to be a leadership trainer or a leadership consultant, but they haven't done that work that you have. They haven't looked introspectively and say, who am I, right? Who is my best client based on me, based on what my strengths going in and my lifestyle and my attributes, and so they skip that because it's pretty much all about leadership, right? And then what they wind up facing is they're now competing with everybody, right? And they have a really difficult time differentiating themselves. They have a really difficult time figuring out, do I go to the Jeep Expo? Do I go to the sushi bar, right? All these questions that are now so much harder to answer because they haven't done that first step. So I just wanted to really highlight that. And it's not that people listening should do something exactly the same way. It can look very different, but just the fact that you took your own philosophy and the way you codify, your philosophy, and you use that as a model to help narrow down who you're going to focus on helping, who you might be able to create the most value for. I just like that's awesome. I just wanted to kind of bring that up before we get into the tactical, because the tactical is where everybody usually jumps into. Do you have any other, suggestions before we jump to the next step in your experience, maybe these are the things that you struggled with to be able to lock it down for people listening that are still trying to figure that out for themselves, their version of flag and their version of who matches. Any little bits of advice you may be able to share with them?
Yeah, yeah, of course. Well, and thank you for that appreciation. It means a lot to me that hearing other people really like find it empowering. And you had mentioned how that it's really the first step to kind of diving in to differentiate. I'm going to have to kind of disagree a little bit. It doesn't necessarily have to be the first step, but it definitely does need to be a step. I've gone through numerous different coaching programs with different mentors and people over the years, and I learned a lot of things from everybody. And I started to replicate my coaching business off of all of the things that they were doing. And this is a great place to start. Just like with the leadership coaching that you were kind of talking about, like it's great to get in and to kind of mimic and copy and kind of reflect a lot of things that other people are doing. But until you do this step, which so it needs to get done eventually, then you can't differentiate. And then you're no different than anybody else. But when you do, when you finally decide to kind of dive in and figure out what makes you unique and all of that, then all of a sudden the gates start opening because now you can direct yourself towards those individuals. So if you're in the earlier stages, if you're listening to this right now and you're somebody who's, I want to do this, I want to do that, but you're struggling to kind of figure those out, what makes you unique, find a mentor or a coach that you can copy until it's time for you to dive into yourself. The sooner you do the uniqueness and figuring out your flag, the better it's going to be for you. But until then, if you want to just get the wheels moving, it's best to find somebody who's closely related to you so you can start to follow their steps.
That's a great advice too, because I'm thinking, when somebody's starting out, or even if they've been in business for a while, what happens to your point earlier, sometimes that's not the first step, and it doesn't have to be. And a lot of times people will go into this field and they'll have a pretty deep network, and that's great. And they're lucky in the sense that they can start developing some client relationships and some projects right away. And so they get to a point, maybe years in even, that they've never even gone through that process. And then they eventually, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes will hit that plateau where now it's like they can't figure out really how to grow or to narrow their focus or whatever, or to not be running around in a million different directions. And they have to go through this process now. And I like your suggestion about looking at what other people are doing because you can if you look at, let's say again, leadership coaching, right, or training, just as an example,
Mhm.
if you're in that field and you're looking at other people, you look on their websites and you go, oh, I really like what that person's doing. It's all inspiration, right? It's all just
Mhm.
building blocks. But that's awesome. Now we can kind of now jump into tactical, right? Because now there's that kind of philosophical framework. And now the next challenge, right, is like somebody could go in there with a really clear idea. It's like, this is who I want to help, and this is who I am, and this is how it matches, and all that. But then it's still about like, how do I get in front of these people, right? And I mentioned
Mhm.
before about you might already have a deep network, which is a great starting point. But now I'm going to hand it back to you. Just kind of walk us through what that might look like on a tactical level.
Yeah, so in asking for referrals, getting connected, just having more conversations, um, it really just comes down to putting in the work and setting those up and getting out and doing those. And I've kind of created this system for myself. Really, it came from realizing that I have been failing to touch base with a lot of people. I was always looking for more, 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 more. And then I was always forgetting to follow up with like my friends and my family because I took it for granted because I have such a great relationship with them, I felt like I could push them to the side and I could get back to them later. And what I was doing was I was just constantly looking for the new person, new thing without ever growing or deepening the relationships with the people I currently have. Whether they're clients or not, I should still be trying to develop better relationships with people. So then I started thinking, okay, well, my friends call me, I leave a voicemail, I try to follow back up with them, I shoot them a text message, they answer me like a few days later, and the conversation never actually goes anywhere. So I figured I created a little score system for myself. Every time I shoot a message to check in with somebody, I give myself a point. Every time I have a phone call or an in-person conversation with somebody, I give myself 5 points. But if I sit down and I get to break bread and actually have either lunch or dinner or even breakfast with somebody, I get to give myself 15 points. And having this little score system allowed me to gamify my approach to developing better connections. And I'm not going into these connections and conversations and meetings with the intent to sell to these individuals about my coaching program. I'm looking to just deepen my relationship. At the same time, I can ask if anybody who they might be able to connect me with in the different fields and stuff, but I'm just trying to check in with them. And I'm trying to figure out what's going on with them, if there's anything that I can directly do to help them. And then from there, kind of going through. So, as I was saying, I try to send out a couple messages, typically a gratitude practice, just to be like, hey, man, it's been a little while since we've chatted. I remember when we did X, Y, and Z at X, Y, and Z place or whatever it was. And I just want to show some appreciation that it really meant to me that you were there or that that was really cool that you did this. I'd love to catch up. I try to send out a couple of those per day. And from there, I try to then have a catch-up conversation. So I have a check-in message where I show some appreciation and gratitude. And then I try to eventually have a conversation, whether in person or on the phone or even on Zoom, just where we can catch up. And on that catch up, it's me trying to figure out what's new in your life. What have you been doing? How's the family? How's work going? But genuinely trying to care and trying to make sure that I have notes and remember things from our last conversation so I go into these conversations a little bit prepared. And it's not just like the first time ever, but it's like, hey, what's going on? How are the kids? How's that project? And on that conversation, it's offering help. Hey, is there anybody that I can connect you with this project? Or your kids, do you need like a babysitter or a dog walker or whatever their things that they've got going on in their lives? I try to offer some sort of help. And then from there, I can kind of fill them in on the different projects or the new things that I've got going on, and vice versa. Then they want to try to offer some help too. And that's where an easy referral process starts to begin. And then if you remembered your flag, then you can kind of be like, yeah, I'm looking to be connected with other coaches who like snowboarding, or who else do you know? When's the last time you went on a sushi date with somebody? What was that like? And who was that person? Because I'm looking to go have more lunch with other individuals. And then from there, these people, your friends and family, they're offering you referrals. And you use these referrals to connect with them through an introduction through your person. And from there, you can kind of figure things out with that individual. Most likely, you want to set up and be prepared for asking for that referral a little bit better than just like, hey, who have you been with sushi with? But if you're going through the referral process, like, hey, I'm doing X, Y, and Z project. Who do you know through your book club or college football or whatever kind of whatever thing where you might be able to relate with them? And from there, you just continue to develop the relationship with dinner or so on.
And, I imagine, when you're trying to describe this process on a podcast with the headphones on, it's challenging, right? Because it's like, well, then I ask this, and to your point, it's like when you're in a conversation, it's going to come up much more naturally, right? It's like it's all very organic and very conversational, and you get these opportunities not only to find out how can you help that other person, which I'm so glad you mentioned that because I think that gets lost in the noise when people talk about networking. It's easy to forget that networking isn't about I'm going to ask them for a referral only. It's about, hey, I'm here to help them as well, and not just necessarily with my business, or with my services. Um, but the couple of things, again, couple of things to unpack, and I just love the way you're describing this. Again, probably one of the best conversations I've had on referrals and networking and how to actually approach that. I like that you said gamify. I wrote it down. I actually was thinking about that when you said the points, because I think that's
Mhm.
for some of us, really, it's like you just make a game of it, right? But then one thing I thought of when you were saying that, when you give yourself points for activities, I don't know if you've thought of it this way, but you're actually really not only gamifying the entire process, but specifically the things that are under your direct control, right? You're actually you're not, yeah, you might do this as well, but in this example, you didn't say, I give myself 20 points every time somebody becomes a client, right? Because we don't necessarily
Mhm.
always have direct control of that. But every time I reach out to somebody, every time I invite somebody out to eat or whatever, those are all things that you and I and everybody listening can actually do, and nobody can stop us from doing it. Doesn't mean everybody says yes. So I think that's such a great approach because you are demonstrating that you can proactively create as many conversations as you desire to, and build those relationships. And I think, again, where a lot of people struggle, and I'll throw myself in that, and maybe in the past you might have struggled with it too a little bit. But it's like we want to have conversations with more people. We want to build relationships because ultimately we know that's what's going to build our careers, right? And our lives in general. But it can feel very passive, right? It's easy to get stuck in this, like, well, I never meet anybody, ever since the pandemic, and I don't go to the office anymore. So again, I'm not really so much a question, but I'm throwing a lot back at you. I was curious if you had any thoughts on what I just said.
Yeah, I mean, looking at well, going back to the gamifying and making sure that I'm focused on the process outcomes instead of or the process goals instead of the outcome goals, because most people looking to grow their coaching business, they have those certain outcome goals of like, yeah, I want to have 10 new clients or I want to make X amount of more money this year. But like you said, we don't necessarily have direct control over that. We can't just wake up and just magically start making an extra $100,000. But what we can do is we can start taking those actions, those conversations, those phone calls, those lunches, and you can start to pay attention to those. So like, okay, well, if I'm constantly having more of these lunch meetings with individuals and I ask for one person or if I'm seeing if anybody could connect me with anybody else, then that is getting me closer to whatever goal I have, as opposed to just waking up and just sitting and just wishing for more clients. Because that might work for you, but for me, that doesn't necessarily make the pay the bills.
Now, if that worked for me, this would be a very different podcast. Yeah, no, for sure. And I was curious also, when you're talking about you look at notes from these conversations, do you use a CRM? Do you use any kind of tools to help you track all these conversations and to schedule follow-ups?
Yeah, a software that I started using not too long ago that I'm constantly learning and getting better with is ClickUp. Have you heard of ClickUp? No. Well, yeah, it's a great tool and I'm still very very new with it. I'm constantly learning and it's growing and getting better, and especially with AI and a bunch of different things that they're implementing. And I use it as like a task management kind of tool, helping me get through a lot of different projects. And in there, I kind of have like a personal CRM. It took me so long to kind of create a profile for everybody that I try to have conversations with and such. But it does help in the long run. So that little bit of workload in the beginning is starting to pay off, because now when I do go have lunch or sushi with my friend Adam, I can follow up. I can leave that conversation with notes on, okay, I know Adam's new project with this charity is going on this time and that time. And that allows me opportunity to set reminders that the app automatically can plug out. And that fills me in. So, for example, I was touching base with one of my good friend is Bennett, and he was trying to change his career path. And I knew we just had a small casual conversation, but he had mentioned how one of his professors from college had meant so much to him, and he was planning to follow up with their professor to see, because they kept their relationship after school, just to kind of see for a little bit of advice and leeway on what his next move with his industry was. And I remember that, and I just plugged it into ClickUp to, hey, remind me to touch base with Bennett in 6 weeks and ask him about his professor. 6 weeks goes by. I got the notification. I shot a text message to Bennett. Hey, man, how are you going? Haven't talked to you in a while. Would love to catch up. By the way, how'd that go with your professor? And then he got back to me almost immediately, was like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad that you touched base to remind me, because it was such a great conversation. Touching base with him was so powerful, and I loved connecting with him. So I got so much I got to share with you. So then when we got on the phone, our conversation was already so much better equipped and powered to move on to the next level.
And again, you seem like you've got this completely dialed in, which is great. It's such a great example for people. This is something you don't want to leave to chance. You don't want to leave it up to think about all the dozens or hundreds of conversations and relationships that we're trying to build and contribute value to over the course of our lifetimes. And if there's no system, it can be on paper, whatever works, right? But we have all these great software tools, and most of them are free or very cheap. If there's no system in place, it's going to go by the wayside. As soon as things get busy, that's the first thing to go away. And I think it also speaks to one of the kind of human aspects of this is, it's about earning trust with people and building relationships is about consistency, right? So if you and I and people listening can help ourselves by using tools to be that much more consistent, we're the ones that follow up. We're the ones that touch base. We're proactive about it. That's like such a huge advantage, right? And it's not that hard to do. It's just a matter of doing it, right?
Exactly. Yep. The consistency and just having the systems in place. You can get by to a certain extent without having the systems and softwares and tools. But it's meant to help. It's a supplement, and it helps bring you to the next level. So then you can level up the systems and kind of get to the next stages, which is kind of where I'm at and with my business, is trying to figure out, okay, now how do I kind of get to the next level? How do I scale it up? What does my next team member kind of look like? And are they aligned with my values, and so on and so on.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that as we wrap up. Last couple of minutes or few minutes. You had mentioned to me when we first spoke a couple weeks ago about, one of the challenges for you is now figuring out that next step and how do I scale. You had mentioned something about how do you continue to create content without necessarily having to be the only person creating it. So maybe just share a little bit about that challenge, and maybe in the last few minutes we can unpack it a little bit in a way that's helpful for you and people listening.
Yeah, so one of the biggest challenges that I've got going on right now is creating enough content for the different avenues and adventures and projects that I'm working on. I've got a couple of different mini like influencer contracts I've got going on, and then I've got other projects of different companies that I'm like a facilitator or workshop facilitator for, and then also my own things. And it gets challenging because I don't have as much time in the day, because I still am coaching, I'm still traveling, doing a lot of different things. So I guess it's like the scaling up is where I'm at right now. Is like, where do I find great people to bring on, and how do I even attack that?
Yeah, it's tricky, especially since your business, the way you described it, you've built it in a way that is so personal to you, right? And I imagine my guess would be that whatever it is that you're putting out there, whether it's on LinkedIn, which is where I've seen your content, or whatever other channels you're using, would have to fit that, right? Would have to still express you authentically. Am I on the right in the right
Oh yeah.
space with that? Yeah. So, what have you tried so far? Have you tried anything that's worked, or have you tried anything that's kind of flopped so far?
Well, so I've hired a couple of virtual assistants and I've gone through and started to kind of create some processes to handle certain things like my podcast and making sure that that kind of frees me up because a lot of the repetitive things are slowing me down. And it's time for me to kind of direct my attention towards other areas, whether that is having more conversations or following up and deepening relationships with current clients and ex or old clients and friends and things like that. So it's like a lot of the smaller things that I'm trying to now delegate out to other people and using different softwares and things that make things a little bit more efficient.
Have you found that, have you found the delegating step to be, relatively easy for you? I'll say emotionally, right? We can delegate to people technically, it's pretty easy to do it, but as a solopreneur, myself, an entrepreneur, for so many years, I find myself challenged with that. You mentioned podcasting, like for me, that's the next step that I have to personally take is I do all my editing. I do everything with this podcast on my own because I enjoy it. But there's also a part of it where I'm a little bit of a control freak, right? So there's a part where I need to let go of that. Have you had any of that issue for yourself, or is that's not been a problem?
I don't think it's been a problem. I think down the road it might be more challenging if I haven't. Let me just say, so when I've gone through the hiring process and I've hired a couple of VAs to work with me on different projects and they're great individuals. And I think that's what's made it so much easier for me to delegate a lot of different bits and pieces. And I still dive into a lot of things that I love doing. But for like social media, even a lot of the editing and all those things, I kind of just push that out and have somebody else kind of take over that. So then I can continue with the fun stuff for me, which would be the filming or the working with others and connecting and collaborating.
Yeah, and one of the advantages of delegating, you've already been doing, let's just say the podcast as an example, right? You've been doing the podcast for how long? How many episodes approximately do you have?
We are just over a year in, and episode 71 just released about 2 hours ago.
Oh, so you're pretty aggressive with this. As you do this at least more than once a week, basically, right? So in that time, you've built a lot of experience. I imagine there's things that you figured out for yourself of this is kind of like how I like this structure to be. This is what, and so I'm imagining you were able to communicate that to your VAs so that it's not necessarily just handing your baby off for somebody else to figure out. It's more of like you've created a recipe and maybe they can come back and improve or give you options for improving it, but you're giving them something stable to start with, and because you've actually spent so much time building it. Again, I'm guessing a lot because I'm thinking from my personal space, right, from my perspective, but I just want to get a sense if that's kind of like the process of how it's looked for you.
Yeah, yeah. So in the beginning, it was me trying to record. I don't know if you've ever used the software Loom or not, but it allows you to kind of screen record and record yourself at the same time. So then you can kind of direct through for different projects and things that you've got going on. And in the beginning, it was me kind of starting to do that, but then I would have to send them the whole thing, and then they'd have to review all the whole process and watch the videos and stuff. And then once we got to a point where I could then just share the idea, the structure of what I'm trying to accomplish, and then let them go at it. And it gives them the freedom to kind of still put their little spin on it, but then still stay towards the boundaries of what I'm looking to do. And then that sometimes it brings in something new that I'm interested in, like, oh, that's actually pretty cool. I like how that happened, or I like this idea. Let's continue to do that. And it helps me continue to grow and evolve too, because if I'm stuck on with what the way I have and I'm like, oh, this has to be this way, this way, this way, but I'm not open to any advice or anything from anybody else or different ways of doing something, I'm going to miss out on great opportunities that could make it better or attract other people and so on too. So I try to make sure that with the whole process, I'm open to different ideas as much as possible.
Yeah, that's such a great attitude to have. It's like it is cyclical, right? It is iterative. You start out with, I would never recommend to somebody if you're going to start a podcast. Again, we're just using an example. I would never recommend to somebody just outsource it from day one. Don't really have an understanding of how it works because I think you lose out on a lot of internal knowledge of how to create and how to express yourself through a medium. And the same things would go with any other type of content creation. But to your point, once you have that foundation, you have an idea. This is kind of my vision. This is how I like to do it. I let other people now take over the parts that don't require your immediate or your day-to-day input. But then now you're open to them coming back and maybe it might be like, hey, did you see this other software you can use, or did you see this new way we can add these new promos or CTAs? And now you're learning from them. So then it becomes really a beautiful kind of iterative process where you're working with people and but you're not necessarily doing it where you don't understand how the process works and you're really just relying on other people to do it. You can't even judge whether it's a good job or not, right? Um,
Yeah.
anyway, yeah, so much that you said. First of all, thank you so much for joining me. I mean, I again, this has been such a great insight for me to be able to look into how somebody thinks about referrals. It's an area that I absolutely can get much, much stronger in. So personally, I just think you've opened up my mind to totally different, avenues of approaching this, much more structured, much more proactive. In the last, 30 seconds, minute, whatever, for people listening, we covered a lot and maybe somebody listening who's like they've not really been doing a lot with referrals. They certainly haven't been as proactive of what we've been talking about. What would you recommend for them? Maybe the first or second step that they can get going and get some momentum in that direction.
Yeah, I would say the best thing to do is to reflect a little bit, develop some sort of reflection practice, journaling, meditation, whatever it may be, and really pay attention to what works for you. Like we said earlier, it's good to copy other people and kind of get the momentum moving on those things. But then once you really pay attention to what works for you, start doing more of that. And then continue to dive into that as much as you can because that's what's going to keep you unique. And then with the approach to connecting with other individuals, collaboration is really the new form of currency. So making sure that you're connecting with a lot of people and you're sharing your challenges, you're sharing your projects, you're sharing what you've got going on, but then be open to hearing what other people are doing as well and genuinely provide some sort of assistance because when you give you also learn you get to touch base with a little bit more people and expand your network and all everybody else. So you got to go at the approach of what's working well for you, and you got to be genuinely good-hearted with it too. You got to be open to helping others.